Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes is a 2022 collection of 3 stories by Eric LaRocca. The titular novel was a Bram Stoker Award nominee for Best Long Fiction in 2021. I said that I had another Eric LaRocca book in the chute, and this was the one. I initially thought that this was going to be a novella with a couple of short stories included, but it's actually 2 novellas and 1 short story placed at the end. So I'm going to explain the novellas in a little more detail, give my analyses on them, and the short story in a little less detail, followed by my analysis for it. I don't like to recap short stories in full, just because I feel like that kind of takes away the impact of being able to read them for themselves. Like, I recap books and novellas kind of generally on this channel. I give you an idea of the plot, but I feel like people can still read these things and take away something that they didn't get from my review. But with a short story, I kind of can't go into too much detail without ruining the whole thing. So, this is how I'm going to handle it. At the end, I'll do my overall impressions of the collection, and we'll go from there. All right, let's take a look. Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, the first novella of the collection, is written in epistolary format, that is to say, through documentation. In this case, emails and forum posts supposedly accumulated by the police after the conclusion of the story. Our protagonist, Agnes, is on a forum trying to sell an antique apple peeler that belonged to her grandfather. She receives some interest from Zoe, who declines to buy the peeler in favor of wiring Agnes enough money to pay her rent so that she doesn't have to part with her family heirloom. Agnes and Zoe soon develop a long-distance relationship. Zoe has a deep desire to have total control over a person's life, and Agnes basically agrees to be her guinea pig for this. This is quite literally a BDSM relationship they've developed. Zoe drafts up a contract absolutely full of red flags. One of the stipulations is that Agnes has to hand over all of her bank account information, and my brain went, and Agnes agrees to it. A big part of this relationship involves Zoe giving Agnes instructions and basically expecting her to follow them unquestionably. Agnes cracks, however, when Zoe instructs her to find a lizard in the park, keep it in her pocket all day, and then bash it over the head with a rock. She goes through with the instructions, but she experiences a really deep remorse afterwards, and she tells Zoe that she wants to end the contract and just doesn't want to be part of the relationship anymore. And Zoe just says, okay, sure, sorry. And they end things. How anticlimactic. Except that a month later, Agnes comes back and wants to restart things again. Zoe agrees with the stipulation that if Agnes does not comply 100%, they will go their separate ways again, which is, frankly, not that bad. I mean, just ending the relationship seems like a pretty negligible consequence. So they get back together. Digitally, I mean. Zoe keeps dodging any attempt that Agnes makes to have them meet up in real life. And when Agnes says that she wants a baby with Zoe, obviously Zoe's attitude is, well, yeah, but we can't do that. Quick sidebar, I sincerely thought that, this was going to be a major plot point. I was convinced that Zoe was going to be, a catfish or something. She isn't. She isn't. It just so happens that she doesn't want to meet up with Agnes in real life, and that was a red herring. I completely thought this was going to be a catfish situation. Anyway, this is where things start to get, freaky. So Zoe tells Agnes, hey, if you want to fulfill your urge to have a child with me, here's what you do. You get a piece of meat from the butcher. You leave it outside in the sun for a few days. And then you eat the rotted meat. Then you'll be pregnant with a tapeworm. How about that? How's that work for you? And Agnes says, bet. So then Agnes gets a tapeworm. Shock, shock, surprise, surprise. Didn't know it was that easy. Well, I guess it's not that easy, is it? I mean, most of us are not out here, eating meat that's been sitting out in the sun for a couple days, but oh well. But so Agnes gets a tapeworm, and she begins referring to it as her and Zoe's baby. Now, Zoe starts getting weirded out, because suddenly she starts sensing that Agnes has gone off the deep end. So Zoe tells Agnes that she should go to the doctor and get pills to get rid of the tapeworm, and Agnes refuses. At this point, Zoe dips, like she suddenly cares about how far Agnes is going for her, refusing to talk to her anymore. Agnes eventually passes the tapeworm and begins to care for it like it's a real baby. Then she proceeds to use the antique apple peeler to carve her eyes out. I don't know. It's not elaborated on. It's kind of an open-ended ending. I mean, obviously, I know there's a police report at the beginning of the story, but I don't quite know what happened here. So, the epistolary style was a choice. The epistolary style was definitely a choice here. Eric LaRocca has done this before. In his last collection that I reviewed, The Trees Grew Because I Bled There, the story, The Strange Thing We Become, was written in the same style as this one, as blog and forum posts. I had two of the same problems with Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke that I had with that short story. Number one, several of these emails and forum posts do not read like emails and forum posts. Let me give you a quick example from page 88. I got in my car and took a drive out to the park this afternoon, the one you mentioned in your email. There was a huge iron gate that greeted me when I arrived, miniature stone gargoyles flanking either side that seemed to regard me as if incredulous, as if they were about to ask me what I was doing there. At the time, I remember thinking how wonderful it might be if one day we had a place with a gate guarded by little stone beasts with ferocious jaws, little creatures that would belong to us and no one else. So remember, this is an email Agnes is writing to Zoe. She's talking about how the miniature gargoyles seem to regard her as if incredulous, as if they were about to ask her what she was doing there. I have never in my life written an email to someone with that kind of flourish and detail before. It's very literary, and if someone wrote an email to me like that, I might be tempted to view them as a bit pompous or show-offy. You're sending me a message, not writing me a story. Authors that do this in epistolary structured stories kind of annoy me. For me, the mark of a good story or book in this style is that it comes across as an actual thing that I could believe a real person would write. The perceived authenticity of the letter, diary, forum post, text post, whatever, it's key to me immersing myself in the story and believe it. When an author starts writing diary entries or a letter with literary flourish, it just completely takes me out of it. Unless they put in the work to characterize the writer as someone who does stuff like that, then it's more understandable. Which brings me to my second point. As with The Strange Things We Become, the choice of epistolary format was definitely a choice. The tricky thing about writing a story through documents like diaries, police reports, text messages, whatever, is that it inherently limits what we're seeing of the characters. I can't see what's really going on in Agnes's head. I only know what she's writing to Zoe. This is why some authors tend to mix epistolary style with traditional storytelling. A good example of this would be Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, which mixes Amy's diary entries with Nick's actual internal narration. I won't spoil it if you haven't read it, but the mixture of the two creates questions as to each character's ability to be a reliable narrator for the audience. The problem with this novella that I had with the short story is that I only see what's present in the messages. Any subtler mental degradation on Agnes's part is off screen. She starts off normal enough, and when Zoe asks the first thing of her, which is to wear a red dress to work, it's like, okay, that's not the craziest thing she could ask her to do. Then she asks Agnes to leave her underwear in a stall, which she does, and she gets fired. Unintentionally. Agnes was caught because of bad timing. And I thought, okay, she's being a little bit reckless, but not mentally unstable. Admittedly, that contract did concern me, because the part where Agnes was agreeing to hand over so much control to Zoe did make me think, okay, that's definitely not fucking good. But I also wasn't entirely clear on whether or not Agnes was taking the contract seriously or not. Like, maybe, especially since she's not physically with Zoe, she might be thinking to herself, yeah, sure, I'll tell you I'm sleeping nude with the air conditioning on, but I don't have to, and you'll never know. I was partially validated when Agnes freaked out over the salamander and cut off contact, because that was an incredibly wise and level-headed decision to make. She made a good call, and when she went back to Zoe, it spoke more of low self-esteem and loneliness, as well as guilt for Zoe paying her bills that one time, than it did mental instability when she went back. For all I know, Zoe's willingness to cut things off so easily, which was a huge surprise to me, reinforced to Agnes that Zoe could be trusted to control her. When we got to the point of the meat and tapeworm is where things started to fall apart for me. Zoe suddenly cared about Agnes's mental state when she didn't care at all during the salamander incident. Agnes was suddenly intensely mentally unstable, although I guess I could interpret it as her getting unstable because of, being infested with parasites. God knows it can't have just been the tapeworm that came out of that fucked up meat she ate. Jesus, the description of her eating it was foul. My point is that not enough work, in my opinion, went into developing these characters in such a way that I could understand where this was coming from. I'm being generous in assigning parasitic infection as an explanation for Agnes's mental instability, but Zoe's sudden concern that Agnes was going too far was like, Girl, since when did you care? You made her kill an animal when you knew didn't want to. She didn't want to kill a living creature, and she was very upfront about it. You were happy when she ate the rancid meat and got a tapeworm, but now you care that she seems to be unstable when she thinks the tapeworm is a real baby? It's a bit too harsh of a jump. If there had been more buildup, if I'd seen more growing reluctance from Zoe and progressively more unstable behavior from Agnes, I would have said, okay, I see how we got here. But the way that the novella was written, I'm just not tracking it very well, and it feels like things just kind of come out of nowhere. Eric LaRocca's writing is pretty good otherwise. My only criticism on that end was everything I said about the epistolary style he chose for this. So, the second novella is The Enchantment, and it features a couple that move to an island to be groundskeepers for a hotel called The Enchantment after their teenage son crucifies himself to death. I did not misspeak. He somehow managed to crucify himself to death. I don't know. He doesn't get into it. The story starts off the day of the son, Milo's birthday. His parents, Olive and James, are estranged. James has an apartment, and Milo lives with Olive. He's clearly not happy about their impending divorce. That night, as mentioned before, he crucifies himself to death. Flash forward 6 months, and James has gotten a job as a groundskeeper on an island where the hotel, the Enchantment, sits dormant for the season. The day the two settle into their cottage, a young man shows up at their door claiming to be James's son from his previous marriage. James freezes the young man out, but Olive welcomes him warmly. Olive eventually begins to suspect that this young man isn't James's son. He's an angel sent to deliver them a message and begins kissing his ass. She also bing-bongs him behind her husband's back. She bing-bongs James, too, so there's some nice ambiguity as to the parentage of the baby she ends up pregnant with. She begins to gravitate closer to James, freezing the young man out, and then Olive experiences a miscarriage. From here, she begins to believe that the young man is actually a demon, upon which James begins to defend him. As you can see, there's a theme in these stories that no one can make up their goddamn minds about anything. Olive breaks her ankle, and she is forced to accompany James and the young man up to the hotel. She then attempts to poison the young man, but accidentally poisons James and kills him. Olive then experiences a vision? Sure, we'll call it an incredibly fucked up vision in the hotel before blacking out. The next day, it's revealed that Olive is somehow dead, and she can't move on because the young man was, in fact, an angel. And he has to keep her as a ghost on Earth for a while because she took matters into her own hands by trying to poison him and accidentally poisoning James. Olive renews her faith, praying ostensibly to get back into God's good graces so she can pass on and be with her son and husband. This one was... Okay, so the thing about Eric LaRocca, if you didn't see my last review I did of The Trees Grew Because I Bled There, is that he deals heavily in realistic horror. This novella is actually unique in that it actually ends with a clear supernatural element. With that being said, the overall story lacked horror. The only part that really got there for me was when Olive was having her moment after accidentally killing James where things started to get weird and she started seeing some really spooky stuff. But it was a very brief scene compared to the rest of the story and honestly seemed out of place compared to the rest of it. It felt more like something the author put in because he suddenly remembered he was writing a horror story and not because it was something that had been organically built up to. The story seemed confused too about what was going on. Okay, so Milo, that's their original son, crucified himself to death. That has to mean something, right? Especially once we realize there might be an angel here? Nope! Didn't seem to end up meaning anything, at least to my eye. Olive sees Milo as part of that vision at the end, but why he crucified himself and how it tied into the greater plot? Maybe it's just me, maybe I missed something, but I don't get it. It's a hell of a way to yeet yourself from existence if you get my drift. YouTube ain't getting me today, no sir. And then, again, there just seemed to be this lack of development for the character relationships. Olive accepts the young man when James rejects him. She goes all in on kissing up to him, even shellacks him. Then she turns around and shellacks James, and suddenly it's, never mind, I love my husband, and she freezes the young man out completely. Then she immediately whips to, this guy's a demon, after the miscarriage. I suspect there's meant to be some commentary here on Olive's tendency to attribute supernatural meaning to likely unrelated events, but I don't know. It just came across like she was moving in that direction because the author needed her to, not necessarily because it was the most logical conclusion from her perspective. I don't know. I just feel like this one suffered from some of the same issues that Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke did, except that at least that one had the excuse of being in epistolary format. When you're writing normally and are showing me the inside of a character's head, I expect to understand them a little better, and I felt like that wasn't the case for me here. You'll Find It's Like That Everywhere is the name of the short story that comes at the end of the collection. And as I said, I'm just going to recap it very generally, since recapping short stories without going into everything is very difficult. The story centers around a man, Gerald, who finds a bone in his yard with his neighbor's initials carved onto them. He goes to confront the neighbor, who proceeds to make wagers with him. The wagers start off benign enough, but progressively become more sinister. In short, the short story is more realistic horror. Because it was short, I'll say that it didn't quite suffer from the same extent of the issues I have with the novellas, but overall, it was still pretty underwhelming for me, especially the very end. So as for my overall analysis, Eric LaRocca actually has an author's note at the end of this collection explaining that all three stories are tied together by a theme of social expectations and anxiety, and yeah, I kind of see that. Agnes is bending herself to Zoe's expectation because she's in love, obsessed, I don't know. Olive is twisting in the wind to please the man she thinks is an angel, and Gerald in the short story partly agrees to his neighbor's wagers because he's too polite to refuse. Obviously, the concept of what lengths a person will go to in order to avoid offending others or embarrassing themselves is ripe with possibility. The Danish films Speak No Evil, as well as its American remake in 2024, very much concern themselves with the idea of predators leaning in on overly polite or overly conciliatory people, ignoring red flags or crossing boundaries because they don't want to offend. The difference between those films, which I didn't love but were serviceable enough as horror thriller films, and this book is the tension and the consequences. The tension in Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, as I said before, is impaired. Agnes suddenly wants out of the contract, and there are no consequences for it. Zoe agrees without issue. Agnes starts to get squirrely, and Zoe turns out not to be the relentless sociopathic predator I thought she was building up to be. Suddenly, she reverses course and is bothered by Agnes's instability. And again, this is written as epistolary format, which means that I feel like I'm missing some of the crucial stepping stones that would help me understand why they made the choices that they did. The enchantment was eerie, and I was surprised to find out that the young man was, in fact, an angel, given the author's tendency to stay within the realm of realism. But all we got for consequences was a creepy scene in the hotel, and then Olive is just stuck as a ghost? I mean, first of all, I need to make this clear. I don't know how she died, exactly. I don't know how she died. I reread the passage over and over again, and I'm still not clear on it. But, okay, she's dead. She has to stay on as a ghost, and that's sad and lonely, but not really horrifying, since the idea is that she can't move on right now. But she will eventually, and be with her son and husband again. Yeah, it's a consequence, but not really a horrifying one. It's not that bad in the grand scheme of things. And you'll find it's like that everywhere. The one scary part towards the end of the story lasts a few seconds before everything's okay again. It was a blink and you'll miss it moment before the ending, which was pretty tame. Eric LaRocca is definitely capable of writing solid horror. He had a couple of stories in The Trees Grew Because I Bled There that really showcased his talent for horror writing. But my criticism of most of his short stories in that book was that they didn't go far enough to really be horrifying in a meaningful way. They skimmed the surface, even dipped their toes in a little, but ultimately stopped short of taking things to their full horror potential. As of my scripting for this video, Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke has a 3.19 rating on Goodreads. This is with 17,000 ratings. That's 17 and 3 zeros, by the way. So it's a pretty good sample size. And I think why this collection has such middling reviews is because it's marketed as horror, but it doesn't really quite meet the bar I think a lot of people have for horrifying. It's gross, sure, the meat and tapeworm thing comes to mind, but it's not really horrifying. Every single one of these stories had so much potential that could have been realized, but this collection overall just didn't really feel like horror to me. It's unsettling, but LaRocca's tendency to stay so focused on realistic horror makes it feel a little more mystery thriller or dark fiction than it does horror to me. If I had to compare the feeling I had to reading this collection to another book, I'd have to compare it to Ottessa Moshfegh's Eileen. It was eerie, uncomfortable, disturbing, and gross at some points, but it's not a horror novel. It's just a very dark story. I don't know. I don't want to trash anyone who thinks Eric LaRocca is the best thing since sliced bread, but for me this collection just didn't quite meet the bar for what I would consider to be horror.